obviously people sooner or later are going to say this is hollow, and I'm actually more anxious and depressed than ever because I don't have meaning in my life. See, material things don't give meaning. They're just material things. They don't have a meaning by definition. And Jesus says, come to me, I have meaning, you know. And so I think as people get more and more down the rabbit hole of YouTube and all this sort of stuff, I think our message may become more salt and light to people with that.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Shock Absorber podcast here at the Third Space studio at Sorrel Kirrawee. I'm excited to have everyone along with us listening and or watching, and I'm also excited to have Stu. How are you?
Hello, Joel, and hello, everyone.
Hello, Senior Pastor at Sorrel Church. It's great to have you along again for another Shock Absorber podcast. And I also have Tim. Hello.
Okay, Joel.
Children's Pastor at Sorrel Church.
That's the one.
Excellent. Guys, we are talking about the 2010s and 2020s and how we actually minister in those times and how culture changes. And we're looking at that through the lens of different artists, basically inspired by Polyphonic, the YouTube channel. But the artist today is Kanye West. Now, again, guys, just a quick question. How high is he on your playlist?
This morning?
Yeah.
He was very high this morning, yes. No, I know him as a cultural icon, but I don't know. I've tried to get into a lot of hip-hop, and I've never quite got there. I'm too much of a rock and roll.
And punk and...
There's just something I feel missing from the aesthetic of... hip-hop. I do like it in soundtracks. I love watching a movie and having some R&B, hip-hop, that kind of genre come in and just like, So I like it when it suits a feel, but something to chuck in my iPod and listen to in the car, it just doesn't rate very highly.
I feel like Stuart, it really pumps you up when you're doing a workout. Do you ever put some hip-hop on when you're working
I've heard
out?
it at the gym.
Yeah.
You can get pretty pumped on hip-hop at the gym.
I think that's the time I listen to hip-hop the most. So, but what's fun about it is that if we're learning about this artist, we're also learning what they're trying to do as a body of work, not just enjoying their work. So that's what's fun about it. But something that's exciting today is that we have a few guys behind the desk, including your son, Ethan, Stu. And Ethan, you know a little bit more about Kanye than we do. Is that correct?
He's a little bit more rotation on my listening. I got into Kanye when he became a Christian and released some music, and I was like, oh, what does this sound like? And I listened to it. Oh, hey, camera. I listened to it, and then I went back and have now listened to all of his stuff and really, really like it and really enjoy his stuff. It's very cool. And speaking of gym stuff, I have a mate, Tyson, who listens to one of his albums, Life of Pablo, as his gym workout. So he'll work out for the period of time that album plays for.
Oh,
it's
really?
cool. It's pretty epic.
Does he do different things for different songs?
That was the extent of it. He just told me that it hypes him up.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah.
This is the leg song. This is the ab song.
That's right. That's what's interesting, though. Like, one of the things that we'll touch on today is Kanye becoming a Christian. But cultural artifact we've chosen as part of that is when, Ethan, you can speak to this as well, is that when Kanye did the Sunday service choir. Have you...
Yes.
Now, tell me what you know about this and what actually... how it transpired.
Well, he just kind of disappeared and ran off into the desert with a choir. And it was very strange for everyone watching. And then suddenly this stuff started getting released it was just like iPhone videos of Kanye and this choir singing gospel songs. And I think the first one that I noticed that went viral was them as a choir just having fun and singing Smells Like Teen Spirit. and it was like not as a gospel, like all the other stuff they were singing. And they end up singing a whole bunch of different stuff. And as that's progressed, it's turned into a church that he has pretty much started. He's gone on to do a bunch of stuff with that. He's brought in celebrity pastors and different celebrities to sing with it. And it's like a big show every Sunday that has a focus on God. And they sing a bunch of other stuff like that. But it's really interesting that this choir that he's started is so famous and so big. And then that came into this when he released Jesus is King, which is his album, the one that just after he became a Christian, he released that. He was working on an album called Yandi, which was a follow-up album from Jesus. So he'd gone from calling himself Jesus, and he was about to call himself Yandi, and then he brings out this album called Jesus is King that really heavily features that choir singing along with him and bringing that kind of cool gospel. And he'd done that kind of stuff before, like with Life of Pablo. There's a lot of that. But yeah, he really leaned into it heavily. And one of the lyrics in one of the songs in Jesus is King is everybody wanted Yandi, but Jesus Christ did the laundry. And so he's come out with this idea that he's actually been cleaned and changed from what he was before, which is really interesting.
I found it really interesting when he's talking about being a Christian. Is I wonder how truthful he is, because as we talk about a lot of the artists, they've often adopted different personas in order to keep moving along their musical trajectory. But a lot of the times he talks about that 2019 album, Jesus is King, as an expression of the gospel. And then he also had a listening party where he said, this album is made to be an expression of the gospel and share the gospel and truth of what Jesus has done. When I think of the goodness of Jesus and all he does for me, my soul cries out. So I don't want to sound cynical, because I think that might be a bit unfair, but it's always interesting to see what these artists are doing. I always like to come up with a little bit of a quote that we have for one of these artists, and I found one by Joe Caramanica in the New York Times, and he said, Mr. West has the most sui generis hip-hop career of the last decade. No rapper has embodied hip-hop's often contradictory impulses of narcissism and social good quite as he has, and no producer has celebrated the lush and the ornate quite as he has. He has spent most of his career in additive mode, figuring out how to make music that's majestic and thought-provoking and also grand-scaled. He's also widened the genre's gates, whether for middle-class values or high fashion and high art dreams, which quite an interesting description, guys, because that also plays on the fact that he's also gone into fashion design and all that kind of thing. But his roots, which we'll go back to his background just to begin. He was born in 1977 in Atlanta, but grew up in Chicago. He was originally a producer, and he worked a lot on beats for local artists in the mid-1990s. And then he became a producer working with Jay-Z, especially with his contributions on Jay-Z's album The Blueprint, which was in 2001. And he's known to have actually revitalized the career of Jay-Z as a producer and a beat maker. But they reckon that the breakthrough moment in his career came when he almost had a near-fatal car crash in California. He actually fell asleep while driving, and it left him with a shattered jaw that needed to be wired shut in reconstructive surgery. And then 2 weeks later, he called a song Through the Wire while his jaw was still wired shut, which is quite some dedication, I would say. He explored his feelings about the accident and laid the foundation of his debut album. And then the interesting thing is that he almost signaled the end of gangster rap. So, which is very masculine and aggressive, but he had a more preppy fashion sense. He wore it sometimes at the very beginning. He wore a backpack on stage, so he was challenging the authenticity of the gangster rap scene and explored different sounds. It was the funny thing about him was that though he was rising to prominence, Jay-Z's Rockefeller label was unwilling, or almost, I should say reluctant to sign him because it was so different to gangster rap, but then basically started to become popular. So they're like, well, we better sign this guy up. Now, the most interesting thing is, and I think, guys, it'd be cool if you stepped in on this too, is that he became famous for interrupting Taylor Swift's acceptance of a video, a music award. And I don't know if you've seen that, but he gets up on stage while Taylor Swift is accepting the award, and he gets up on stage and says, hey everyone, look, I'll let you finish, but Beyonce should have won this for the Single Ladies video clip.
Yo, Taylor, I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish, but Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time. One of the best videos of all time.
And they're saying that, so Taylor, that almost launched part of Taylor's career. We've talked about Taylor, talking about how she's been criticised and given a hard time. But then also at that time when he did it, Kanye became highly criticised as well, and he went into a moment to write his magnum opus, which is called My beautiful, dark, twisted fantasy. I've got to get that right. Anyway, guys, a lot of information there. Anything you'd like to add to that before we move on to talking about how he impacts culture as much as he does? You got anything to add?
Well, I think that moment at the MTV Awards is really interesting. Firstly, it brings together three of the cultural artists and icons that we've talked about this season. Yeah. Beyonce is there in the moment, Taylor Swift's there in the moment, Kanye's there, and so they're all interacting. So we kind of see there an encapsulation of a lot of these icons that are and what's the dynamic that they have between them. And you're right, yes, it did sort of springboard Taylor Swift, and it also divided the public opinion of Kanye. And I remember watching it when it first came out and seeing it come up on YouTube and all social medias. And again, I only knew all three of these people as cultural icons. I wasn't a fan of any of their particular musics, but I knew who they all were. And yeah, immediately I thought, oh wow, yeah, like this guy's a real jerk, isn't he? Like, you know, as if you'd interrupt someone else's acceptance, and you know, and quickly became a meme, and just got into the whole ethos of the culture. But the number of things mixed up in there. There's ego. There's we're going to talk a bit about consumerism and the way that impacts as well. Just all these artists, the competition that's there, the rivalry that can sometimes happen. It is quite an interesting moment and interesting that he's dealing with that. I think you had some of your research here, Joel, that I can't remember who. Someone recommended to him that it was good for him to leave the country.
Oh yes, yeah. I've got to find who that was.
But he basically goes and goes to Hawaii to do his
Mos Def.
Yes, and so it does take this big break from the public scene for a while, and then comes out with a grand album at the end of it. Really significant moment for his career, for Taylor's career, and of course. The touch point was it was also had been a big year for Beyonce as well.
Well, like all the artists that we've looked at, as you saying, Tim, there's always the artists manage to stay on top of the game, always ride the waves of culture, and so but it's also mixed with the way that they adapt as an artist. So with the first maybe 3 albums that Kanye released were about him on the come up, becoming famous, becoming really an important part of the musical scene. In 2007, Graduation album, the 50 Cent's Curtis came out at around the same time as Graduation. And that was where they reckoned that was where the moment that gangster rap ended, because Kanye sold more than 400,000 more albums than 50 Cent did. And 50 Cent had actually... Kanye, I should say, wanted to emulate U2 after touring with them. He wanted to have such a grand experience. So he's like built up to this point of like, now I can do arenas. And then he released 808s and Heartbreak. He's like, it's lonely at the top. So now I need to move on again. And that's when he has that moment. It's lonely at the top. I'm going to go out and annoy Taylor Swift and a number of her fans. Get told by Mos Def, I need to leave the country. And now I'm going to record my big piece of musical artistry, and that's when he goes to Hawaii and records. I think he hired out the studio for like 6 months. It's like no one else is coming in the studio, guys, which I think is funny. And then like after that, it's also he'll do collaborations with Jay-Z. Then he gets to Yeezus, as we're talking about. It's like a self-deification moment. He's now, I'm at the top. Now I'm going to turn myself into a god. And then as we get later on into 2019, Jesus King, I'm going to give him. He's saying that he's going to give himself over to the real God, which is fascinating. Stu, like we talk about a lot of things, how the artist matches the culture, but we also, what we've been doing this season is looking at how a number of frameworks that Ian Hussey has set up. I'm wondering, we talked about consumerism. I'm wondering if you can help us link those things that Kanye is doing to the things that Ian Hussey is talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in a couple of Ian Hussey's categories for understanding culture. Wealth and consumerism is a really big part of our culture in Australia and Western cultures, and also secularism. I think that's an interesting thing to talk about today, with him self-deifying himself and then actually proclaiming to become a Christian. And that's a really interesting, divergent, countercultural aspect to him. So he's got this sort of culturally relevant aspect with this wealth and consumerism, and then he's got this almost countercultural perspective that he had as well. But if I could take the first one first, I think it's interesting the way people display power in our culture today. I think that if you go back 200 years to the big powers of the day, the big powers would be self-aggrandizing themselves with really elaborate shows of power. And for example, the British Empire, which was a really big empire, they conquered India and ended up taking on all the glamour and splendor of the Indian culture, almost to say that we need to be as splendid as the Indian culture and have all this pomp and regalia if we're going to rule this country. And post-British Empire, they've still got the pomp and ceremony stuff. You go to any royal event these days in London and you'll see all these flags and soldiers and you'll see the Queen processing in this really ornate 200-year-old horse and carriage, this sort of stuff. But then if you compare that to that old, if you compare that old form of power to new forms of power, and you look at when you can see it most when you see the President of the United States meeting with the Queen, new forms of power actually show themselves by understatement. So the American president will rock up in a black limousine just wearing a suit, very simple. And it's almost saying that I am so powerful I don't have to dress up like that. So the old power would dress up to show power, and new power dresses down. And so when you see award ceremonies, you often see music artists rocking up to this fabulous, expensive award ceremony, which is the pinnacle of their year, I suppose, as an art industry, and they'll wear a T-shirt and a pair of sneakers and a pair of jeans. That was particularly prominent in the 80s. Although I think the hip-hop style has taken that in a new direction. There seems to be, again, a new flavoursome to the cultural aspect there that seems to be coming up with people like Kanye West, and the glamour seems to be coming back again. However, when you look at that moment when Kanye gets up on stage and says, I don't agree with this award going to Taylor Swift, there's almost this, he's so wealthy, that he's so powerful that he doesn't have to abide by the protocols of that scene, and he can actually stand up and just, in his own mind, he can stand up and say, well, actually, I disagree. And funnily enough, a lot of people actually go, wow, you are so powerful and so wealthy that you can do that. So, Tim, it was interesting hearing your response to that as, oh, that's rude to get up and say that in someone's speech. But I think a lot of people would have read that as, wow, you're very, very powerful. You're very wealthy.
Knowledgeable of the industry.
Well, very wealthy. So wealth brings power. So in our culture, as in many cultures throughout history, wealth is the ultimate power, isn't it? So his wealth and prestige is almost going beyond the award ceremony. He doesn't need the award ceremony. It's almost like he doesn't care what the institution thinks. And we've come up against that anti-institutionalised form of our culture too previously, when we've talked about how in modern Australia and Western countries, anti-institutionalism is a new value that people have. It's almost like a sign of righteousness if you can be anti-institutional. So he just really understands that moment, and I think it was thought through. And it was a protest against Taylor Swift getting something that he thought Beyonce should have got, but it's also, I think, about him as well. That's how I read it.
And I also wonder, in terms of the institution, that he and Beyonce have institutional power within the pop scene, and here's this up and coming, young person who doesn't have that same influence, power in the scene, and so there is a little bit of that anti-establishment, as you say, but there's also maybe a protection of their establishment, their institutionalization of power, and not seeing this young up and coming person as being worthy, perhaps, of this award, which actually should have gone to the Queen of Pop, and validating her already existing power. Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. Yeah,
so no matter how wealthy he is or how powerful he is, he's leaning into that new power dynamic of like, I'm going to actually show power by standing up now and criticising this. And if he'd have done that in the 1950s, that would have had a completely different reaction from the public. It would have been the end of his career, but actually it was the beginning of his career, because that was really interesting, isn't it? So, and I think, again, what we're going to talk about today and next week again is that we've got to be really careful that we don't approach culture the same way as these artists, as the church. We shouldn't be learning and understanding culture so that we can become culturally relevant and have these kind of dynamics. I mean, it's quite tempting for us as Christians to abide some of this stuff. This confidence that comes from that particular expression of power, for example. There's just this swagger that comes from that. And I was at a church planting conference last year where one of the speakers was saying, if we're going to have successful church plants and we're going to be successful leaders in our culture, we need to have a humble swagger. And I thought that was a strange phrase, humble swagger. And then I thought about it and I thought, I wonder if they're actually seeking to in some way abide this sort of swagger that the hip hop world has, and this I can get up on stage and disagree with an award ceremony. I have so much swagger, the confidence, yeah. But I think I came away thinking about that a lot, and I think to add the word humble to swagger doesn't actually counteract that swagger. And I think personally, what we're exploring in this series is how do we be countercultural to that, and rather than have a humble swagger, how do we just be humble leaders? And I think it's good to understand our culture, but I think we've got to be really careful we don't syncretize our culture with the church. And we've said a number of times over this season that with the homogeneous unit principle, there is this embrace of culture, but Hussey is encouraging us that the Bible writers always embrace and critique culture. And I think we're really seeking to do that humbly, but we're seeking to be willing to critique our own culture and listen to the Bible writers as God has inspired them through His Holy Spirit, that we might actually not think like humans. And I was thinking for today's episode, a good verse for that for me is Romans 12, which is one of my favourite chapters in the Bible. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and I think that's really important as we listen, as we understand people like Kanye West. We need to be prepared to be transformed and not try and create a church like he would necessarily. Not judging his latest forays into Jesus is King, but definitely not be Christian leaders who want to produce swagger, because as we've seen, that has actually led to some arrogance in church leadership, and it's actually led to the fall of some whole ministries, like the whole Mars Hill thing. I look at that story with a great deal of sadness and think, was there a swagger about the presentation of some of the leadership in that church with Mark Driscoll and stuff? I think, for many people, I remember some of my friends saying about Mark Driscoll in the 2000s, like, he seems to be able to be so culturally relevant and he's really able to speak into the cultural moment. And my response was, it sounds a bit arrogant to me. And I feel like, even before I knew much of the backstory, I was like, it didn't really appeal to me, that presentation of Christian leadership. And so, I think it's really important that we don't syncretize. So again, if people don't know what syncretism is and never heard that before, syncretism is taking two ideas and turning them into one idea. And it's sort of a form of idolatry where you profess a faith in Christ, but then you actually bring to bear cultural artifacts that actually are not concurrent with clothing yourself with Christ. They're actually counterproductive to your faithful expression. So I think the Christian church throughout history has always struggled with this syncretism, and we've got to be really careful in our generation that we don't create a cultural cool Christianity and try and be like that. I think we can stand back from that and say, we can understand it, speak into it, but not actually become like it.
Yeah, well, that's part of the embracing and critiquing, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
it's like trying to decide whether what we should do with it based on the Bible rather than the other way around. I thought going back to that My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy time for him, just a little bit more information in that, because it does seem a very pivotal point in his career. There was a story from Razar from the Wu-Tang Clan, who actually went out there and recorded. He went out there for 2 weeks to Hawaii, and he's like, man, I've never seen an artist work the way he does in terms of Kanye. He said that basically all his team get together, they have breakfast, and then they they talk about what the day before's recording went, how they plan the next day's recording, and then they exercise and play basketball together, and they do a little bit of charity work or whatever, and then they hit the studio at 4 p.m, and sometimes they do it for 12 hours, which is a magnificent work ethic, whether whether that played out later on in terms of he actually talks about mental health. That's the other thing we should talk about. He actually really brings the discussion about mental health into the mainstream a lot as well, given his struggles with mental health.
Which brings up another one of Hussey's categories, Joel, which is anxiety and depression. He says our culture is really framed by that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another thing that we can touch on, right? But
can I jump in here?
Oh, absolutely.
Just before we move too far away from what Stu was saying before,
yeah.
Just on that discussion of power and the discussion of that album, he released a song in that album called Power, and I just want to read a line or two from that. Where it says, "My furs is Mongolian, my ice brought the goalies in. I embody every characteristic of the egotistic." And then the chorus goes, "No one man should have all this power." And it's just this idea of he's gotten to a point where he is too powerful. Like he is the ice brought the goalies in is this idea of like he's got so many diamonds that like a hockey goalie they need to be like guarding him but it's this understanding of the power he's got, and in his album in his song Champion, I think it's that song, he talks a lot about being a role model, and sorry.
All right.
Yeah, in the song, I think it's in the song Champion. He talks a lot about being a role model and what that looks like. Yeah, do you realize that you're a champion in their eyes? Yes, I did, and he talks a lot about that. And he understands the power he's got in all of those spaces, not only in the stuff that you were talking about, Stu, but also in the eyes of the people that are listening to him and consuming. And you were saying that that we don't want to be like him. And all these artists, we see their power and we actually realize that we want to be, we can learn from them, but we want to be different to them. But what he's saying is, yeah, people want to be like me. Everyone be like me. And so that's some really cool points that are directly from his lyrics, from that conversation there. And just while you were mentioning the mental health thing, I think his diagnosis with bipolar is a really important thing just to have that underlies all of this discussion. Because as we talk about Kanye's changing and his shifts and his, because he does a lot of them, like he is jumping around regularly and he's doing big things and he's pulling, like he's had more unreleased albums almost than released albums, like because he's brought like, It's actually quite wild how many. And the album that came out this year, Donda, it came out last month. It was supposed to come out at the start of this year, and he said no. And then someone leaked it, and so he released it. Like it wasn't even a thing that he wanted to do anymore. And that's like got 25 songs on it. Like that's a huge body of work that he wasn't even going to release. That's what I've read anyway. And yeah, it's really interesting that underpins a lot of what he does and a lot of the things that as we talk about him, understanding that, yeah, that mental health stuff's pretty intense for him as well. Sorry to jump in there, Joel, just before, thought I might just add that in before you moved on.
Really interesting.
No, it's totally fine. It's interesting how he does move on to he has the mental health struggles that he talks about, but then if you perhaps look back at his music, you probably see that earlier on when he didn't actually talk about it. So there's all those shifting between the two different things, and I shouldn't profess myself as an expert in mental health, but bipolar is obviously switching between two different modes that are either very depressive or very like manic. But the other thing he also does is start talking about African American issues as well, in a different way to the way that Kendrick Lamar did. So that's another thing that he's doing. So I find it interesting how he has said, it's almost like he's again reflecting the culture, going, I need to be the best. I need to earn the most amount of money. I need to work the hardest. I need to attain all this power that I need. And then he gets to a point where he's like, I've achieved so much power, then my ego has overtaken me so much that I need to, hang on, I need to actually change again. And I suppose that's where I was saying being cynical again, is that I wonder if he's doing it for his career and to keep feeding that ego, or he's doing it because he's actually having a realization of, I need to change the person of who I am.
I think I've did a little bit of reading into this when it first happened, was because I had those same kind of thoughts, and he was admitted into a mental health hospital because of the bipolar stuff and some other things that were going on, and in that time all he had was a Bible, and so he was reading his Bible every day and getting to know that really well, and he realized that through this whole time, like even from his first album with Jesus Walks, like he's been saying, I am a Christian, and like I'm like he's talking and making gospel music and doing all this cool stuff that's really Christian but not Christian, because it's Kanye being self-centric and worldly and all this other stuff that but when he came out of that hospital time, he said, actually no, I'm going to change my life because I actually think this is legit and I think this is true. And there's lots of stuff that he hasn't changed, and it's very easy for us to look at that and go, oh, how legit is it, or how sure of it are we? But I think it's quite interesting to see that what changed him was not, I had a cultural moment, but instead it was a moment of weakness where he turned to the Bible. And I think that's for me, I feel quite confident saying he's a Christian at the moment. Because I see that as the thing that turned him, not, I had this big conversation with a really big famous pastor in America and that's what changed my life. So yeah, I find that really interesting.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And certainly, I don't know the guy, don't know him personally, and not in a discipleship relationship. I'm not going to make a comment on whether he will be in new creation with me or not. But what I do find fascinating is what we talked about before, and you were saying the syncretism, Stu, is that if he has had a true repentance moment, which would love to think that he has, there's a lot to disentangle himself from in terms of the culture, and there's so much of the pop music world, the hip hop world, the way that he's crafted his own personality as this messianic figure in his own right, to disentangle from. And so even that idea that, as he becomes a Christian, has a faith moment, and then thinks, well, what do I do with this? The tools that he has available to him to think about, how am I going to respond to this conversion moment? Well, I'm going to release an album and I'm going to sell it. And so there's still this this world that he's in where I produce art for consumption, and I have these moments. I leak YouTube videos of my gospel things out in the desert so that they get cultural traction, and that's not a judgment. It's just that it's a noticing that is the cultural world that he is in, and so there is a lot of things that is just part of maybe that syncretism that he, we can look at people who are not famous and not involved in that world to that extent, and it's easy to look at and see, oh well, he's clearly got some syncretistic things going on there that he needs to disentangle himself from. I'm sure that in 100 years' time, or even right now, my brothers and sisters can notice things that I haven't disentangled from. But I just think that that's an interesting part of the conversation as well, is how does he reflect kingdom values? How does he reflect, this born again nature that he has as a superstar? What would that actually involve? How would you actually navigate that space?
And celebrity conversions isn't anything new.
No,
there was a lot of cynicism around Paul's conversion. That people were quite concerned, is this guy actually a Christian? And I think that was justified, and people were waiting to see what the result of that was. A long time afterwards, Augustine's conversion was also, people wondered about his conversion. John Newton, the famous slave trader who became a Christian, who would then go on to write Amazing Grace and influence Wilberforce to be an amazing voice against slavery and actually overturn slavery in the British Empire. He was actually questioned, is he really a Christian?
And even John Newton, part of his story is he became a Christian and stayed in the slave trade for a while afterwards. It took him a long time to disentangle those things as well. And so again, there's none of a judgment about eternal salvation here. It's just a noticing of what's going on for that person and the time it can take for a genuine repentance to actually bring about gospel change in someone's life.
Yeah, and then, bringing that up to modern times, I mean, I remember reading about the conversion of Bob Dylan. He was converted as a Christian, according to what I read, which I'm not sure if it's right or not. It might be worth looking up again. But according to what I read, Randy Stonehill and Larry Norman from the Jesus Movement had some role in converting, helping Bob Dylan to make a commitment to Christ. And then he made 2 famous albums, which were Slow Train Coming and Saved. So he wrote those 2 albums. And it was a similar kind of moment as the Kanye West moment, which has just come out of the blue. All of a sudden, Bob Dylan singing about Jesus, like, what's going on? So the critics panned it. No one bought it. And later in the 1980s, Larry Norman said, if they didn't listen to Bob Dylan, they're not going to listen to you. So that was actually used by Larry Norman to say another thing about these big celebrity conversions is sometimes the celebrity will become a Christian, and a lot of Christians assume, oh, now this person's a Christian, everyone's going to become a Christian. But that doesn't always equate either. But I don't know where Bob Dylan's at with his faith these days, but it was a moment that caught the world's attention, actually. So that was similar. A lesser known but very similar thing is that not only sometimes do secular artists cross over into faith contexts, not just Christian either, by the way, just before I move on, famously George Harrison took the Beatles over to India during the 1960s, and they were trying to connect with Eastern mysticism, and that brought a lot of New Age thinking into popular parlance, so that was interesting. But yeah, it also can go the other way too, that Christian artists can cross over into a secular context as well. So again, probably not as well known, but there was a famous Christian artist in the 80s, Amy Grant, that had a go at writing a secular album. In the 1990s, Ep.6 was a very big tooth and nail artist on a Christian label that then crossed over into secular music. So there's this interesting journey that some people take one way and the other. So with Kanye, I think it's not without precedent, and I think the temptation for Christians is to either decry it or to completely embrace it. But again, Ian Hussey's really helpful, that we need to have that, I think more helpful stance of using the Bible as our authority and being prepared to even do this with our own lives too, as you said, Tim. Like, none of us have completely without our culture that we belong to. And, if we go back to that idea of wealth and consumerism, I mean, wealth and consumerism is the air we breathe in Western society. And I remember John Piper making a bit of a famous call once, and he said you should become friends with dead people, because it's good to read books by Christians from other generations so that they might speak into your culture and actually speak into your life too. So while we're speaking about Kanye West and analysing his story, which is fine to do, we should also be, every time we point one finger forward, we've always got 3 fingers pointing back at us. So, but as we think about our country, Australia ranks as the second best country in the world for its quality of life, according to the United Nations Index. According to Hussey, Australians can expect to live for 80 years. That's people generally who are living in the cities. The national income per person is about $60,000 a year. The Australians are also the world's second largest consumers of textiles, buying on average 27 kilograms of new clothing and textiles every year. So we might look at the bling that Kanye West wears, but then again, thinking about ourselves would be helpful to think that we Christians and people who don't have faith are all influenced by this kind of way of living. Consumerism is very wasteful, total wasteful consumption of goods and services that were never or hardly ever used was over $10.5 billion a year annually. So we buy $10 billion worth of stuff that we don't even use very much. And he goes on to say the addictive nature of consumerism is highlighted by the fact that despite Australians being wealthy, they're working longer hours in order to earn more money so they can feed their consumption. So it's a form of idolatry that we're stuck in. Despite our great wealth, we are more likely to take than to give. Gershom Nimbleblucker, great name, advocacy manager of Baptist World Aid, fantastic organisation, pointed out that Australian Christians currently give on average just 2.6% of their income to charity, which is lower than the 3% given by a broad Australian community during the Great Depression. So we're giving less and less money as we get more and more wealthy. He also reported that the Australian Bureau of Statistics from 2010 show that we are spending 25 times more on recreation than on giving. So we spend 25 times more on our holidays and our fun pursuits than we give to other people. And obviously the Bible has a lot to say about wealth. So as we're looking at the wealth and power of Kanye West, we need to also think about the fact that we are incredibly wealthy. And in fact, Hussey points out that one of Jesus's favourite topics of discussion was wealth. He goes on and he says this, he says, a wander through the car parks of most suburban churches in Australia would illustrate that consumerism is not just a problem for the broader community. We have here perhaps the most important and threatening features of Australian culture. That's a big call. Like maybe one of the most threatening features of Australian culture is our wealth. We look to the authors of various chapters of this volume. So he goes on. And then it's interesting, his next category after that is anxiety and depression, which we've also looked at. And he said, despite our wealth, in 2014, 2015, there were 4 million Australians, 17.5% of the population, who reported having a mental or behavioural condition. So when Kanye comes out and says, quite openly and talks about some of his problems, as some of the other artists we've talked about, it's actually a feature of our zeitgeist at the moment, our cultural moment to talk about these things. I think that's really, people connect with it. So at one point they're finding him really appealing because wealthy, we're all consumers, and at the other level we're all anxious and depressed. I was at a sports chaplaincy event a couple of years ago when they brought out a lady from the wellbeing team from the NFL, National Football League in America, and she was saying that she thinks that what they're looking at in America at the moment is the next epidemic that's going to come through after COVID is probably going to be loneliness and people not having any friends. And so here we are getting wealthier and wealthier. We're more and more anxious and depressed, and we're actually more and more lonely. And so we have so much to share about how Jesus offers so much more than wealth. And Jesus says you can't follow two masters. You can't syncretize. You can't follow wealth and him, because you'll love one and hate the other. So it is a really big warning for us, and a really fascinating topic to raise through this artist today, guys. Yeah.
Well, in talking about Kanye very much getting into Christianity and being saved, he said in 2019, when I was trying to serve multiple gods, it drove me crazy. In reference to, he said the god of ego, the god of money, the god of pride, the god of fame, and that I didn't even know what it meant to be saved, and that now I love Jesus Christ and I love Christianity. And I think that's an interesting way to parallel what you're talking about there, Stu. As part of the Shockers Law podcast, we always like to think about, well, how can we move forward in a way that we are, as Hussey says, embracing or critiquing culture in a way that Jesus wants us to. My question for both you guys, and maybe I'll start with Tim, is how do we have conversations about this, given that, as Hussey said, it's probably one of the biggest threats to Australian culture, Australian Christianity, because of the culture. How do we have these conversations about money and wealth and perhaps fame and all those kind of things? Like, are you planning to become an Instagram influencer anytime soon?
I don't know if anyone will be interested in buying what I'm selling, but I've got nothing to sell. But I do. There's a number of ways that we can tackle this. I think there is a huge part, particularly for the young people in our communities, in our churches, who do see being an influencer as a genuine vocation. So that's the start. That's the first thing. So they do think that and aspire towards being a YouTube star or an influencer on other social media, on TikTok or Instagram are some of the biggest, with the ones with the biggest followings. And so there is a desire for that to be a genuine vocation. And so I think there is a part of the gospel as we speak into that, which will challenge that and will say, well, what are the motivations? And we can use examples of people like Kanye, who even when he is at the peak of his fame, he's also writing lyrics about how unhappy he is, and that he's critiquing himself and not quite sure what to do with that. And it's, again, one of the really lovely things about his conversion story is the quote that you just read out, where he's actually realizing he was fighting against trying to worship so many gods, and it was until he gave those up and embraced Christianity and Christ as his saviour, that he seems to be more free of those things. And so there is a critique there on the desire to be influential, the desire to be famous, and to think that that is where we're going to find fulfillment. So there's I think it's a good word of critique to our culture to do that. At the same time, maybe something to embrace about that is that young people want to have purpose. They want to have things that they can grasp hold of. They want a life course which does have influence, and that's exactly, in some ways, how Jesus describes the Christian life, that there is, we're being salt and light. They're not weak images. They're really powerful, strong images of the way that when we embrace Christ and we live according to the ethics of his kingdom, we actually can have a significant influence in our culture. We might not become YouTube stars with it. We might not be able to sell beauty products on Instagram, but there is actually a subversive power in that. And so I think trying to work out how do you communicate that to young people in a way that doesn't just bait and switch. You're not trying to say, oh, you want power? Here's power. But actually says, no, actually, when you come to Jesus, when you embody the ethic of the kingdom, that is a purposeful life. Which I think was one of the things that John Piper in sort of late 90s, early 2000s really sort of peak Christian cultural moment with his book Don't Waste Your Life, was this idea of you actually can embrace all of the goodness of life and have that influence and have a purpose towards life that is actually kingdom-centric. And so there's a way of communicating that, and I don't think I'm very good at it, but there's a way of communicating that to young people that says, here's what you're longing for. Your longing is for influence. Your longing is to be a change agent in the world. Or we see the way that young people embrace climate change and other social issues. And we say, yes, that impulse is right and good. There is something that's really, really beautiful about the way that God is crafting in you to be a change agent, and to be influential in that way. Let's paint a picture and set a vision before you about how being part of Jesus' church, the local church, the global church, can actually fulfill those desires that you have in you, and actually can provide that for you. And let's, as a church, be a local church that embodies that, and that actually shows that and shines that forth. I think so. There's some of the things that come to mind when I think about that influence.
Yeah, that was cool. Thank you, Ethan. Do you mind if you jump in on this? I'd be interested to know, because you're a youth pastor at Solve Church, you obviously have a lot of contact with a younger crew at our church. What is important to them in terms of this stuff? Do they see money and power and social issues as really important to them, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think so. Going even younger, just off some of the stuff that Tim has said, I've had a lot of chats with primary school kids, and often it's a question. Oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And
that's just when you're teaching the scripture.
I have worked at a before and after school care at my local primary school, and have hung out with those guys. And what do you want to be when you grow up? Is one of the questions I ask, and because it's just a way to chat, and so often the answer is, I want to be a YouTuber. That is really interesting, because that really reflects the stuff that Tim was talking about. It's what they're consuming and what they're seeing is a really valid way to have a career.
I can be
what they're seeing,
and I can easily create myself as an influential figure.
And they're the people I look up to, not astronauts. It's not I want to be an astronaut or
or even a movie star or a pop star. When that was the media that we were consuming, generations ago.
Yeah, I want to be a rock star.
That was the peak of influence. Yeah. But as you're noticing, it's the YouTube and is the peak of influence.
And then fasting forward past high school, I did a communications degree at uni, and one of the things we got to do as our communication degree was they literally were like, for this subject, just put something on the internet, and we'll call it a digital artifact, and you'll get marked on it. It'll be great. And so I was like, yes, free marks. But for a lot of people, what they did was they were like, I'll just be an influencer. Some dude got to 6,000 followers on Instagram, and all he did was look at the stuff I do in my day. and he had abs, and that was how he did it. But but it was just this idea of that's the, like, previously it would have been to I don't know, there would have been lots of other things to attempt to do online to be legit, but a legit way of getting a legitimate way of getting marks and being seen as someone who's using the internet correctly is trying to be an influencer. And then we get to high school and we see all these teenagers that don't watch TV and they don't even really watch movies, and they don't, especially now that COVID's been a thing, like no one goes to the cinema. Some more people are doing that now, but sitting and watching YouTube is a valid part of entertainment. And the stuff we consume on YouTube is all of that stuff.
I do it. Well, people will be watching this on YouTube as well. Right?
Exactly. And that's okay. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with it. But it's just that cultural shift of the people that have power and influence are just normal people on the internet rather than Kanye. Which is alongside Kanye. Like I had an anecdote from before that I thought would be funny to talk about while you were talking about consumerism is the air we breathe. That is very true. So much so that at a very recent airing of Donda, which was Kanye's latest album, there were people selling air from that concert because they were like, this air has heard Donda.
Oh, wow.
And so they went in with like Ziploc bags and they like captured the air and they Ziplocked it and then they sold it for thousands of dollars online. Like they didn't just sell it for $20. Like, haha.
Yeah.
Like it's such a consumer driven thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, let's throw money at this because it's such a big deal. Now, when we talk about teenagers, that's the world they live in. And so of course that's what they, and young people, of course that's what we see and that's what we are surrounded by and consumed by and result in. Yeah. Like we will end up like that. Like who has the most expensive shoes is a really big thing.
Yeah, sneakerheads.
Yeah.
All that kind of thing,
like,
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that I'm thinking about with this too is that we do have another tool that postmodernism has given us, and it's called deconstruction. And so some of our listeners and viewers might not have heard of that before, but a very prominent theme in our culture these days is to take something and then to change its meaning, and sometimes even reverse something and reverse its meaning. So as I was talking before about power, that old power was regaled in imperial splendor. Modern power deconstructs that to a t-shirt and a pair of jeans. And I think it's fascinating when you see photos of people meeting the Queen. And there's a really famous photo of an Australian comedian who was, what's the guy who was Crocodile Dundee? What was his name? Paul Hogan. Yep. When Paul Hogan met the Queen, he was wearing a pair of shorts and a ripped shirt. And it was this funny photo of Paul Hogan just wearing these, 1970s casual wear from Australian point of view, meeting the Queen, who's all dolled up in a regalia. And or you see a rock artist, meeting the Queen wearing a t-shirt and she's got a crown on. That's called deconstruction. And we can actually use that tool actually in the church as well. So some of our viewers might be seeing that we're wearing Soul Revival shirts. And you might look at that and you're thinking, hang on, you guys are talking against consumerism and you're wearing Soul Revival t-shirts for your church. What's going on there? Well, it's taking people from the known to the unknown. So people are used to seeing apparel that people wear, and it sort of helps to identify people with a cultural artifact sometimes in our culture, with a semiotic or a symbol of who they belong to. Like surfers wear billabong or rip curl, and even different ages of surfers wear different things. So older surfers like me wear billabong, but younger surfers might wear, Mad Huey's brand or whatever. We distinguish ourselves sometimes by what we wear, and that goes
wear Supreme.
Yeah, Supreme. Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's a bit of an identity thing there we're having a bit of fun with, but also rather than selling things to make money for ourselves, to create wealth for ourselves, which might be the expectation, we're deconstructing this idea of wearing t-shirts by taking all the money that we earn and giving it to Aboriginal ministries in northwestern New South Wales, so that we're actually giving it away. And so that causes people to have a conversation. Oh, why wouldn't you keep it to yourself? And you can have a conversation about, does money ultimately satisfy anyway? Is there more good? And Jesus says in Matthew 11:28-30, that famous famous phrase, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." And I think the irony is that the more consumeristic we get, the more burdened we get by that. It becomes our idol, and it's a really harsh taskmaster. We have to work harder and harder to get more and more, and the more we have, the more we want, and we've never got enough. And they talk about now that consumerism is even the process of opening a box or carrying a bag through the shopping centre. We're getting pleasure out of those kind of moments, and people who are marketing things to us understand that and try and give us those moments. And it's sort of it's almost like a drug that people are on that we can't get off. Whereas Jesus is saying, look, if you think wealth and material things will give you pleasure and satisfaction and ultimate security, obviously people sooner or later are going to say this is hollow, and I'm actually more anxious and depressed than ever because I don't have meaning in my life. See, material things don't give meaning. They're just material things. They don't have a meaning by definition. And Jesus says, "Come to me, I have meaning." And so I think as people get more and more down the rabbit hole of YouTube and all this sort of stuff, I think our message may become more salt and light to people with that. The other thing I want to say just briefly as well is I think we've got to be careful too as Christians that we don't try and be syncretising into this world of wealth and this world of cool and try and create a cool Christianity. Back in the early 90s, I thought maybe the reason people weren't going to church anymore is because it was so daggy and not cool. But the cooler we tried to be, the less people that were interested. And I remembered back in the late 80s, I was in a university lecture in my political science degree where my lecturer said, talking about Australia actually, saying that in the first part of Australia's modern history, Australia had a big cringe towards feeling that they weren't good enough, and England was the place where you would go if you wanted to get your career going for art or for music or for business or whatever it was. So there was this sense of cultural cringe, it's called, that we're not really as good as Britain. And then after the Second World War, there was a cultural cringe towards America, that America was so fantastic and we had to copy them if we were going to be cool. And I remember thinking about that my lecturer said that, funnily enough, one of the key moments that broke that a little bit in Australian culture was that famous boat race. What was that boat race in the early 1980s? The America's Cup. Australia won a boat race called the America's Cup, and everyone went mad because we beat the Americans at something. And then all of a sudden people started going, maybe we can be a bit more confident just to be Australian. Maybe we don't have to have this cultural cringe. And I got thinking about that in the early 90s, and I started thinking, I wonder if I have a cultural cringe as a Christian, that I think Christianity is not quite as cool as the secular world, and I've got to create a Christian version of the world. And yet Jesus is saying, no, walk away from that, and you can't serve two masters. Just come to me and I will give you rest. So I think for me that deconstruction of postmodernism to say, let's actually create something, well, not create, let's actually express something different in the church to the world can be good. Now, I'm not saying we get that right all the time. In fact, you were talking about shoes a minute ago. We often talk about the shock absorber as things we've tried that have worked okay with young people, but I'll give you an example of one that hasn't worked so well in our past, and that is we tried to tackle this wealth thing a little bit too bluntly once upon a time. Back in the late 1990s, everyone was wearing skater shoes, and they were really cheap and quite grassroots and organic. And so there was a big skate culture and surf culture in Soul Revival in the 1990s, and we're all wearing skater shoes. It was quite punk back in those days. But then I think the marketers got on to the fact that all the kids are wearing Vans and all these shoes, and they started inflating the prices of these shoes. So once upon a time, they were the cheapest shoes you could buy, and you can get a pair of shoes for $50. And then all of a sudden, the same pair of shoes was now worth $230. And I remember having conversations with teenagers who were getting part-time jobs so they could afford their shoes. And I started thinking, well, that's not necessarily how we have to go. And I had a bit of a go at this deconstruction thing. And I said, well, what if we, in a talk one night at Soli's, I said to the community of young adults, I said, what if we decided to do what we did in the early 90s and buy shoes because they were cheap, not because they were fashionable? Why do we have to keep buying these skater shoes just because they're expensive? Why don't we all buy Volleys, which was a brand of shoes back in the day that was $25? I said, why don't we just buy shoes like that? And literally 75 people left our group after that talk, because they said, don't dictate to us how we use our money. That's like you're controlling us. And like I might not have presented it very well, but I tried really hard to do it with freedom and to say, let's opt into this. But just by challenging that, and it was before, challenging, these big corporates for the price of their shoes was a bit trendier, you know, in the 2000s and 2010s, when issues like, buying shoes that aren't made by people under ethical fashion. That's the word I'm looking for. You know, later that would become a bit trendy, but before it was trendy, we were sort of saying, why don't we buy shoes that don't get made by slave labor and they're actually cheaper? And it was just such a massive shock to the system that 75 people left our group over that. And so I think it's possibly we didn't do it very well and didn't raise the conversation real good. So that's good to learn a lesson from that. But at the same time, it is such a big part of people's lives now that I think there's a famous saying where people say the last thing to get converted in a Christian is their wallet. And I think there might be a little bit of truth in that.
Yeah, for sure. Would you agree with that, Tim? Any final points as we wrap up the episode?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I remember that talk.
Do you really?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Right.
And a couple of the brand names you particularly called out. But
is that because you were wearing them?
No, I wasn't. No, I was too cheap. I mean, I was poor, and I don't think I could have afforded those brands if I wanted to. But I think through a lot of this and talking about, as we've talked about, influence and power and those kinds of things, one of the verses that has come to mind is Psalm 73, which is very similar to Jesus' words about "Come to me, you're weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest." It has that same sort of flavour to it as a psalm, even though it's in the Old Testament before Jesus. And the psalmist here, Asaph, he talks about, he said, "As for me, my feet had almost slipped. I nearly lost my foothold, for I envied the arrogant and I saw the prosperity of the wicked." And then he goes on for almost 2/3 of the psalm talking about how great the life is of the non-Christian or the non-Israelite, and how wonderful their life is and how he just envies them and that he looks up to them. He goes, "I want to be like that," and trying to chase after the things of that world, thinking that is where he's going to find his pleasure and his fulfillment. And then the crux comes. Oh no, I can't find it. Where's the verse? But he talks about. Sorry, I'll find it. Here it is. "I tried to understand all this." This is verse 16. "I tried to understand all this. It troubled me deeply till I entered the sanctuary of God. And then I understood their final destiny." And that's the turning point of the whole psalm. Because what he does is he walks into the temple, the church of the day. He fixes his eyes on God, Yahweh, and he realizes, where he is and whose he is. And that helps, it gives him the slap in the face, the bucket of cold water, to realize, no, all those other things that I look at and I envy and I see all of that and I want all of that. And then I get this big bucket of cold water on my head that says, no, this is Yahweh. For us, up the other side of the cross, this is Jesus. He is actually where I'm going to find my rest. And I think it's really interesting. I was really struck by that line in Hussey's essay where he talks about the giving and the fact that Christians today in the late 20 or early 21st century are giving less as a percentage of their wealth than they were during the Depression.
When they had nothing.
When they had nothing. I just think that is so striking. And also, while they didn't have the same metrics for mental health during the Depression years as we have now, that whole field has grown remarkably. It's undeniable that the rates of mental health have deteriorated rapidly over the last few decades. And so that somehow there's a correlation there between the fact that we have all of this money and we're desiring all of these things. We're stuck in the first 2/3 of this psalm. And the thing for Christians, firstly, internally, and then to shine out to the world is actually that pivot point in verse 17 to actually turn, there is rest. There is fulfillment. And to turn it all back to Kanye, I really do hope and pray that this conversion experience he's had in the last few years is genuine, and that he's finding these moments where he does not need to rely on his album sales or his fashion or his crowds or all of that acclaim that comes with being the sensation and the cultural influence he is, which is why we're talking about him, but can actually really find his rest in Jesus. And that's what I would love to be able to put out to our church to our young people, and then continue to shine that out into the community.
Yeah, I think listening to you talk about the Psalm 73, is that right?
Psalm 73.
It's just a clear indication of like how unchanging God is.
Yeah.
Too, because like it's like he's talking about prosperity there, but prosperity is all in different forms, and consumerism and wealth has all been in different forms from perhaps the beginning of time. I was reminded of a story. I'm in the middle of a biography on John D. Rockefeller, and John D. Rockefeller is like the richest man in the world in the 1800s. Like his oil company, Standard Oil, actually got split up by the US government in the early 1900s, and it's now forms 3 of the biggest oil companies in the world today. So that's Exxon, Chevron, and BP. So that's like how widespread his company was. And he was like, I need to give money away. He's very influenced by the Baptist Church. And he gave it's like, I need to expand my philanthropic efforts. I need to do something about this because I've got so much money I don't know what to do with. And so he decided he wanted to start a university. And so they went back and forth, I should be in New York or should be somewhere else. And eventually they settled on Chicago. And they became really enamored with a biblical scholar, a guy called Dr. William Harper. And he was originally at the time, he was at Yale. And he actually went to, like, he was a boy wonder. He went to college at 10, took his BA at 14. He completed his PhD at 18.
Cheers.
And so he's like...
I still haven't completed my PhD and I'm 53.
Yeah, that's right. So Rockefeller's like, you're going to be the head of that university. He had to took some convincing, but he eventually ended up doing it. And Rockefeller's thing was always like, start small, do it. And Harper went in just big time, just like hiring all the big names at the time from all different schools to become part of the faculty. But at the same time, he was on quite a large salary because Rockefeller wanted to give him the money he deserved. But then he also went on the lecture circuit and was earning lots of money doing that. He went on a big European holiday as well. And there's a quote in the book where it says, it was an odd situation. The world's richest man was chastising a biblical scholar for unseemly materialism. And I thought that was really interesting because on the flip side, to bring it back to Kanye, that was at the point that Rockefeller really started to experience a lot of mental health issues as well. So I think I tell that story just because, as a reminder of what you're saying, Tim, that God doesn't change. Like even now we're really consumeristic. I think that we're the most or second most indebted country in the world in terms of private debt. So we're obviously spending a lot of money on a lot of things. But Jesus doesn't change, right? Jesus changes everything, but he also doesn't change because that's why he changes everything. So I think that was a really encouraging way to finish up. So thank you very much for that, Tim. Let's wrap up this episode. I do think we do need to start talking about the internet and how it drives consumerism. So I think that's a good thing to wrap it up and maybe talk about in later episodes. But guys, if we did talk about Soul Revival apparel, if you would like to purchase some of that, where all the profits go to our Indigenous ministry partners, you can go to soulrevival.shop. We'll put the link in the show notes for that. We have a very exciting podcast coming up next episode where we actually have Ian Hussey coming on. So we're really excited about that. And we're going to talk about all those things that we've been talking about this season. You can check out all our podcasts on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. And as always, we like to finish up with one way.
One way.
Thank you.